Gentleman from Minnesota reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
I brought a war powers resolution to the floor of this Congress to get U.S. troops out of Syria, arguing that the United States, being excessively entangled in great power competition in Syria, wasn't making life better for Syrians, it wasn't playing out to our benefit in the sphere of great power competition, and that it left U.S. service members and contractors as sitting ducks. And following that vote, which I lost overwhelmingly on a bipartisan fashion, sadly, there were casualties. There was the death of an American, because we have now become the neighborhood crime watch of certain areas in Syria where there are oil rigs. And that's what it's all about. So I now come to the floor with this resolution to repeal a 2004 emergency vis-a-vis Syria. 2004. Now, it's supposed to be voted on by Congress every 6 months thereafter, but we have been derelict in our duty in doing so. And so I'm glad that today we're bringing forward a number of these emergency resolutions that have just been dormant slush funds, spending untold sums of money with no transparency as to how much is going into the Syrian emergency. But how about this rule for how about the House thinks about emergencies? Nothing's allowed to be an emergency for 20 years. Because if it were really an emergency, there probably would have been some cataclysmic event of biblical proportion before the 20 years. And if it's still an emergency 20 years later, it's a chronic condition, and the United States cannot be the world's policeman, and we cannot be the world's piggy bank. Now, if the principal argument against my resolution is that my resolution is soft on Assad, well, the logic that undergirds that is that somehow the 2004 resolution was this great anti-Assad tool that we must have, that we must maintain to beat Assad. Well, look around, Mr. Speaker, Assad's never been stronger. So if this 2004 resolution was Assad kryptonite, it's been the worst Assad kryptonite you could ever imagine. It's malfunctioned. So I think we ought to repeal this emergency. We have sought transparency to see how much money has been going pursuant to it. We don't know the answer to that question. And to the extent that there are sanctions that we still want to maintain, whether there are the other national emergencies that exist targeted at terrorism generally, at Russia, at Iran, the Magnitsky Act, there are all kinds of other authorities for the President, the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of the Department of Commerce, even the DOD weighs in, state, regarding sanctions regimes. So this is not a vote to lift sanctions and then just hope for the best with some pretty gnarly Syrians. In fact, it's us standing up to do our job, and that's what we should do in repealing this 2004 resolution. I reserve.
I can't think of a more effective way to insult the President of Israel when he stands on that podium and addresses us tomorrow.
Well, I would observe, Mr. Speaker, to the gentleman that if he is looking for a more effective way to insult the President of Israel, he need look no further than the remarks of some of his own colleagues in the recent days, which I would deem far more insulting than this policy debate about how to have an effective sanctions regime. No one here is arguing for sanctions relief vis-a-vis these individuals. What we're saying is that the National Emergencies Act is a very ineffective, inefficient way to administer a sanctions regime. We do have specific authorities with the Magnitsky Act, with the national emergencies vis-a-vis counterterrorism. Treasury has these authorities, state has these authorities, and most importantly, Congress has the authority to impose sanctions. If you believe that there are people who should be the subject of sanctions by the United States government, we are the board of directors of the most powerful country on the planet Earth. We can introduce those bills, we can vote for them, and we can fulfill our constitutional authority. What I'm asking the Congress to do is to repeal a 2004 emergency vis-a-vis Syria when Syria doesn't look anything like it even did in 2004. And to my Republican colleagues, if you vote to allow this national emergency to continue, what you're doing is you're gaslighting unaccountable spending by the Biden administration because they never have to make requisite report regarding the outlays on these matters. And the money just moves around. We never quite see the efficacy of it. And we are all strong supporters of Israel on this side of the aisle, certainly, and I would observe that U.S. policy in Syria has not particularly helped Israel. Matter of fact, when you had terrorist groups setting up camps in Syria directed at Israel, you know what the Israelis did? They took them out. They blew them up. That sent a message to Iran. The balance of power was restored, and it did not involve the United States of America becoming the bloc captain of Syria or anywhere else in the Middle East. And if we want to do that, it should be through a war powers resolution with Congress affirmatively voting to do it, not just having rolling national emergencies when the law contemplates a requisite obligation for us to vote to reauthorize these things. We never do it. We don't do our job. Then the money goes out the door, and we don't see a safer Israel, a safer Middle East, or a safer Syria. All we see is an empowered Assad. So if this is the great tool we had against Assad, we better be thinking of some different ones, because it hasn't exactly worked out as the proponents of this national emergency would seemingly indicate. I yield back.
Does the gentleman reserve?
Does the gentleman reserve?
All reserved.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from South Carolina is now recognized.
I reserve the right to close.
Okay. Gentleman from Minnesota.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as